there is a particular kind of electricity that moves through a city when history decides to show up uninvited. You can feel it in the air before you see it in the streets. A low hum, a collective tension, the sense that something ordinary is about to become something that textbooks will argue about for decades. I have felt that electricity in Caracas and Cairo, in Istanbul and Jakarta, in the back alleys of Tehran and the grand boulevards of Paris. And I felt it again, watching the feeds and the footage pouring in from across an America that, on the 28th of March 2026, decided, in numbers that nobody had quite dared to predict, that enough was enough. They called it No Kings, and what a name that was. It was not the first time this particular movement had taken to the streets. The first No Kings protest had come in June of 2025, drawing roughly 5 million Americans out of their homes and into the public square in what was already a remarkable act of civic defiance. Then came October of the same year, and the numbers swelled to around 7 million. Each time the White House waved it away. Each time the movement's coordinators, a loose, decentralized coalition anchored by the groups Indivisible and 5501, meaning 50 states, 50 protests, one movement, quietly went back to work, deeper into the suburbs, further into the small towns, further into the red states where you would least expect to find anyone marching with a sign that read, "So bad, even introverts are here." And then came March 28th, 2026, the third wave, and this time something qualitatively different happened. Now here is the part that the headline numbers only begin to capture, and we are going to get into the real anatomy of this day in just a moment, because the geography of where these protests happened matters as much as how many people showed up. The flagship event was not held in New York, not in Los Angeles, not in Washington, D.C. It was held in St. Paul, Minnesota. That choice was not arbitrary. It was a statement, a deliberate act of geographical symbolism, because Minnesota had become, over the preceding months, the epicenter of one of the most contested and painful chapters of the second Trump administration. It was in Minneapolis that federal immigration agents had fatally shot two American citizens, Renee Good and Alex Pretty, during what the administration called Operation Metro Surge, a large-scale immigration enforcement sweep that had descended on the Twin Cities with the cold efficiency of an occupying force. Their names had become rallying cries. Their names were on signs. Their names were in the song that Bruce Springsteen, yes, that Bruce Springsteen, the one who had been channeling Woody Guthrie for 5 decades, performed live on the steps of the Minnesota State Capitol, a song he had written and released in January called Streets of Minneapolis. Springsteen stood there and told the crowd, "Your strength and your commitment told us that this was still America. And this reactionary nightmare and these invasions of American cities will not stand." The crowd, measured by independent analysts at well above 100,000 in St. Paul alone, roared back. Joan Baez was there, Jane Fonda was there, Bernie Sanders was there. Robert De Niro appeared on a video screen and said he woke up every morning feeling depressed about the direction of the country, but felt something different this particular Saturday. The symbolism was almost too dense to process in real time. Folk music royalty, Hollywood conscience, and a senator from Vermont who had spent his entire career being told he was too radical, all converging on the steps of a Midwestern state capital to tell the most powerful man in the world that his power had a limit. But, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, and I want you to pay close attention here, because what I am about to describe is the detail that most mainstream analysis completely missed. 2/3 of the more than 3,300 registered events across all 50 states took place outside of major urban centers. Let that land for a moment. Not in Manhattan, not in San Francisco, not in Chicago's Grant Park, where around 200,000 showed up, not in Boston Common, where an estimated 180,000 gathered, but in Driggs, Idaho, a town of fewer than 2,000 people in a state that Donald Trump carried with 66% of the vote in 2024, in Rocky Ford, Colorado, in Eudora and Leavenworth and Olathe, Kansas, in Evansville and Muncie, Indiana, in Wyoming and Montana and South Dakota and Louisiana, states that are about as reliably Republican as anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The organizers reported a surge in registrations from what they called electorally competitive suburbs, in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. These are the places that actually decide American presidential elections. These are the places that in November 2026's midterm elections will determine who controls Congress. The White House's response was to dismiss the entire event as the product of leftist funding networks with little real public support. The press secretary said, with a straight face, that the only people who cared about what she called Trump derangement therapy sessions were reporters who were paid to cover them. This was said on a day when somewhere between 8 and 9 million Americans were in the streets, in all 50 states, in towns that had never seen a political march in living memory. Historians will note that the Roman Senate also had some interesting things to say about the crowds gathering outside the city walls in the final decades of the Republic. Now, let us get to the real breaking point of this story, because the No Kings protests did not exist in a vacuum. They were happening simultaneously with something else, something that connected the streets of Minneapolis and Los Angeles and Washington with the streets of Tel Aviv and the ruins of Tehran, the Iran War, 30 days old on March 29th, 2026. 30 days since the United States and Israel had launched what they named Operation Epic Fury, strikes that began on February 28th, and within their first hours had eliminated Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of senior military figures. 30 days of missile exchanges, of Hormuz choking closed, of the International Energy Agency declaring the current disruption the most significant supply shock in the history of the oil market, of Houthi missiles arcing toward Israeli cities, of Lebanon's south being carved up once again by Israeli armor, of Iran's Revolutionary Guard broadcasting threats to strike American and Israeli-affiliated universities across the region. 30 days of a war that, in the words of an unnamed American intelligence official speaking to Reuters, had produced certainty about only one thing, that the Pentagon had confirmed the elimination of roughly 1/3 of Iran's missile arsenal. The status of another third was, in the official's careful phrasing, less clear, 4 weeks, and the Pentagon was still not sure what it had actually achieved. The protest in America was inseparable from the war in Iran, and this is the connective tissue that most Western commentators were reluctant to examine directly because it complicated the tidy narrative. The marchers in New York's Midtown carried signs that said, "No war," alongside signs that said, "No ice in our streets." The demonstrators in Boston erected a memorial honoring children who had lost their lives in missile strikes in Iran that the United States was reportedly responsible for. In Austin, someone left a small ice sculpture inscribed with the words, "Ice melts in Texas," to liquefy in the Texas sun. A dual-purpose pun so perfectly American that you had to admire it even while acknowledging the darkness it was commenting on. In Washington, protesters marched past the Lincoln Memorial and onto the National Mall, carrying signs that read, "Regime change begins at home," which was, if nothing else, a pointed piece of rhetorical judo directed at an administration that had openly declared its objective in Iran to be exactly that. The grievances were plural, layered, and interconnected in ways that defied single-issue framing. Immigration enforcement, the Iran war, the cost of gasoline, which had risen sharply as Hormuz remained effectively closed to commercial shipping, and oil prices had surged more than 40% since the conflict began. A proposed piece of legislation called the SAVE Act that protesters saw as a direct attack on voting rights, the Epstein files, the pattern of federal law enforcement raids on Democratic-run cities carried out with a theatrical visibility that seemed designed as much for psychological effect as for any stated operational purpose. Here's the detail that nobody in the mainstream press was willing to say out loud, but that the numbers made undeniable. This was not a coastal liberal protest. This was not the resistance of a demographic bubble talking to itself. This was a genuinely national phenomenon, and its presence in the deep red heartland of the American interior suggested something that political scientists call a realignment signal. The moment when a governing coalition begins to lose constituencies it had assumed were permanently secured. Trump's approval rating had fallen to 36%, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll published around the time of the protests. That is not a number from which administrations historically recover. That is a number that triggers internal conversations in political parties about survival, about whether the ship can be turned before it hits the rocks. Ezra Levin, co-founder of Indivisible, was already calling for a nationwide economic action on May 1st, a workers' refusal in spirit, if not in legal form, urging people to skip work, skip school, skip shopping. We're going to show up and say we're putting workers over billionaires and kings, he said. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story, because while 8 million Americans were marching against their own government on March 28th, something remarkable was happening on the other side of the world, in a city that has always been the most honest barometer of where Israel's internal contradictions are headed. Tel Aviv, Habima Square, Saturday night. The anti-war protest in Habima Square had started small. A law student named Itamar Greenberg told CNN that the first time he had organized a demonstration against the Iran war in the early days of March, it had been just 20 people. He had been among those detained, then 50, then 200, then 400. On March 28th, he estimated the crowd at around 200, and this was in a country where the Home Front Command had imposed wartime regulations prohibiting outdoor public gatherings of more than 50 people. In a country where 78% of Jewish Israelis, according to a poll published by the Israel Democracy Institute the day before, expressed their backing for the war against Iran, the police came. They came with force. At least 21 people were detained across Tel Aviv, Haifa, Jerusalem, and Beersheba. Border police officers were filmed forcefully removing demonstrators, knocking people to the ground, holding at least one protester in a chokehold. An Arab member of the Knesset named Ayman Odeh, the chairman of Hadash Ta'al, who had been active in the anti-war movement since its earliest days, was seen being physically restrained by border police despite holding parliamentary immunity. Afterward, Odeh described the officers as acting in the service of the government and said they feared the heroic citizens who went out despite everything to make their voice heard. The banner that protesters carried read, "Say no to the eternal war of the Kahanist government, yes to just peace and security for the peoples of the region." And here, right here, is the detail that nobody was talking about, but that was deciding the game. The protests in Tel Aviv were gathering momentum, not losing it. The first week, 20 people. 4 weeks later, 1,200. The organizers of Standing Together, the Jewish Arab activist coalition central to these demonstrations, noted in a statement that, for the first time, anti-government groups that had previously stayed away from anti-war protests were joining in. This is the first time that the Zionists have been out to protest the war, Itamar Greenberg observed with a kind of bewildered precision. The Liberal Zionist Center of Israeli Civil Society, the constituency that had filled the streets for months in 2023 protesting Netanyahu's judicial reform, had been sitting out the Iran war protests. Until now, a 52-year-old tour guide named Yoram, who declined to give his last name, stood at the edge of the Tel Aviv rally and said something that deserved to be heard far beyond the square. We are 4 weeks into the war and nobody actually knows what is the aim. A 76-year-old woman named Joanne Levine said she believed the war was part of Netanyahu's game plan, a way of ensuring his own political survival by keeping the country in a permanent state of mobilization that made criticism of the government feel to many Israelis like a form of betrayal. This is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. It is not unique to Netanyahu. It is not unique to Israel. It is a technique that emperors and kings and presidents who want to be kings have deployed since the Babylonians discovered that a foreign enemy is the best possible distraction from a domestic accountability crisis. You invoke emergency powers, in Israel's case, the Home Front Command regulations technically prohibiting gatherings of more than 50, to give legal cover to what is, in practice, the suppression of political opposition during wartime. And you hope that the critical mass of citizens who might otherwise push back never finds its voice. The problem, as March 28, 2026 demonstrated on 2 continents simultaneously, is that voices tend to find each other. Let us zoom out to the wider frame. Because the protests in America and Israel were happening inside a geopolitical context of extraordinary turbulence, and the two things were feeding each other in ways that had real strategic implications, not just for the upcoming American midterms, but for the entire architecture of the conflict. The Iran war had entered its second month with no clear exit ramp visible from Washington. Vice President Vance had told reporters it would continue a little while longer. The Pentagon was, according to the Washington Post, quietly preparing plans for potential ground operations. Not a full-scale invasion, the officials were careful to say, but raids by special forces and conventional infantry troops. The echoes of every American military adventure since Korea were almost too loud to ignore. The short timeline that expands, the mission that creeps, the exit strategy that reveals itself upon examination to be mostly theoretical. Meanwhile, in Islamabad on March 29th, the foreign ministers of Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia sat down together to try to figure out a diplomatic pathway out of the catastrophe. This was not a NATO meeting. This was not a UN Security Council session. It was four Muslim majority nations representing a combined population of over 600 million people sitting astride the energy corridors and trade routes connecting Asia to Europe to Africa, deciding that if the Western powers were not going to end this thing, someone else was going to have to try. Pakistan had already been acting as a quiet back channel between the United States and Iran, confirmed by Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff. Iran had agreed to allow 20 ships under Pakistani flag to transit the Strait of Hormuz daily, a small concession that Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar called a harbinger of peace. The detail nobody was talking about, but that was slowly, quietly reorganizing the geopolitical furniture, was this: the countries doing the actual diplomatic work to end the war were not the ones who had started it. Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Four countries that did not belong to the Western security architecture in the traditional sense, meeting in Islamabad on a Sunday morning, trying to de-escalate a war that Washington and Tel Aviv had launched, while simultaneously the Pope was standing in St. Peter's Square on Palm Sunday, telling tens of thousands of the faithful that God does not justify war, with special prayers for Christians in the Middle East. Something was shifting. Not dramatically, not in the kind of headline-grabbing way that television producers love, but structurally, tectonically, in the way that the deep plates of geopolitical power shift when the surface-level arrangements stop working. This is where we need to bring in the long view. Every empire eventually reaches the moment when the story it tells about itself no longer matches the experience of the people inside it, or the people it claims to be liberating outside it. The Athenian democracy that sent its fleet to Sicily in 415 BC with grandiose strategic ambitions did not know that it was destroying the foundations of its own power. It found out later. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which at its peak was the most sophisticated civilization on the planet, found itself unable to manage the simultaneous pressures of internal political fragmentation and external military overextension. Rome cracked not from a single dramatic blow, but from the accumulation of internal contradictions that eventually exceeded the system's capacity to manage them. At that moment, in every case, the streets began to fill. The No Kings movement did not call itself an empire-ending movement. Its language was democratic rather than revolutionary, reformist rather than transformational. It talked about the ballot box and the midterm elections and the restoration of norms. It was, in the most precise sense, a constitutional movement, an appeal to founding documents rather than a rejection of them. And yet the fact that 8 million people in all 50 states felt compelled to spend their Saturday marching in the streets was itself a signal that the relationship between governed and governing had entered a genuinely new and unstable phase. Now, the real breaking point starts here, and it involves a detail that requires us to look at what Donald Trump Jr. was doing on the same Saturday that millions of Americans were in the streets. He was at a business summit hosted by Saudi royals where he was photographed mocking the No Kings protesters. Let the irony of that image sit for a moment. The son of a man whose movement spent years talking about reclaiming America for ordinary Americans was at a luxury event hosted by the royal family of a petro-monarchy, while his father was simultaneously prosecuting a war partly in defense of that same Gulf monarchical order, laughing at the citizens marching in his father's backyard in West Palm Beach, where pro and anti-Trump demonstrators briefly clashed a few miles from Mar-a-Lago. The symbolism, unintentional as it may have been, was almost baroque in its precision. You truly cannot write political satire more effective than what reality was producing that afternoon. In Portland, Oregon, the day's events extended into the evening with a harder edge as a group of demonstrators converged on the city's IC facility after the main No Kings events had concluded. Border Patrol agents deployed tear gas. In Los Angeles, around 1,000 demonstrators surrounded the Roy Ball Federal Building. In Dallas, the main No Kings March encountered a counter-protest led by Enrique Tarrio, the former Proud Boys leader, and minor scuffles broke out before police made several arrests. These were the exceptions. The overwhelming character of March 28, 2026 was not chaos, but something far more unsettling to power. It was order. It was millions of people, the vast majority of them utterly peaceful, exercising a right that the Declaration of Independence describes as not just a privilege, but a duty. 8 million people doing something peacefully is, in many ways, a more powerful political statement than 8 million people doing something violently. Violence gives power an excuse. Peace takes that excuse away. The global dimension was not incidental. In Rome, thousands marched against Premier Giorgia Meloni and against the Iran war, waving banners calling for a world free from wars. In Paris, at the Bastille, the geographic symbol of the moment when the French decided that one particular form of monarchy had run its course, Americans living in France gathered alongside French labor unions and human rights organizations. In London, in Berlin, in Australia, in Latin America, in Canada. The organization noted that in countries with constitutional monarchies, the protest was being rebranded No Tyrants, a semantic adjustment that preserved the spirit while respecting local constitutional sensitivities. The world was watching, and the world was not neutral. Trajectories matter more than snapshots. The French Revolution did not begin with the storming of the Bastille. It began with years of accumulated grievance, punctuated by moments of sudden coalescence, moments when people who had been suffering separately suddenly recognized each other across the space of a public square. The squares of Tel Aviv and the squares of Minneapolis and the squares of Paris and Rome and Boston were not connected by a common ideology or a common language or even a common set of demands. They were connected by a common question. Who does this serve and who does it cost? 8 million Americans asked that question on March 28, 2026. A few hundred Israelis asked it in Habima Square and paid for the asking with a night in a detention facility. A few thousand Europeans asked it in Rome and Paris and London. The Pakistani foreign minister asked it more diplomatically in Islamabad. The Pope asked it in the language of Palm Sunday in St. Peter's Square. And in every case, the honest answer from those in power was the same. A silence dressed up as a press release, a dismissal dressed up as authority, a fear dressed up as confidence. Because when the people in the streets do not know exactly where they are going, and the people in power do not know how to stop them, and the diplomats in the middle do not know how to make either side listen, that is not chaos. That is the moment just before the map gets redrawn. The question that stays with us, the one that no amount of tear gas or approval rating polls or White House press statements can actually answer, is this. In the new map being drawn right now, in the streets of Minneapolis and Habima Square and Islamabad and the choked sea lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, who gets to hold the pen? And perhaps more importantly, do the people currently holding it even understand that it is already changing hands? That is the question for the next episode. We will be watching very closely.